The Critic is Artist, Section 2 of Part 1. Ernest. I am quite ready to admit that I was wrong in what I said about the Greeks. They were, as you have pointed out, a nation of art critics. I acknowledge it, and I feel a little sorry for them, for the creative faculty is higher than the critical. There is really no comparison between them. Gilbert. The antithesis between them is entirely arbitrary. Without the critical faculty, there is no artistic creation at all, worthy of the name. You spoke a little while ago of that fine spirit of choice and delicate instinct of selection by which the artist realizes life for us, and gives to it a momentary perfection. Well, that spirit of choice, that subtle tact of omission, is really the critical faculty in one of its most characteristic moods. And no one who does not possess this critical faculty can create anything at all in art. Arnold's definition of literature as a criticism of life was not very felicitous in form, but it showed how keenly he recognized the importance of the critical element in all creative work. Ernest. I should have said that great artists worked unconsciously, that they were wiser than they knew, as I think Emerson remarks somewhere. Gilbert. It is not really so, Ernest. All fine imaginative work is self-conscious and deliberate. No poet sings because he must sing. At least, no great poet does. A great poet sings because he chooses to sing. It is so now, and it has always been so. We are sometimes apt to think that the voices that surrounded the dawn of poetry were simpler, fresher, and more natural than ours, and that the world which the early poets looked at, and through which they walked, had a kind of poetical quality of its own, and almost without changing could pass into song. The snow lies thick now upon Olympus, and its steep, scarped sides are bleak and barren. But once, we fancy, the white feet of the Muses brushed the dew with the anemones of the morning, and at evening came Apollo to sing to the shepherds in the vale. But in this we are merely lending to other ages what we desire, or think we desire, for our own. Our historical sense is at fault. Every century that produces poetry is, so far, an artificial century, and the work that seems to us to be the most natural and simple product of its time is always the result of the most self-conscious effort. Believe me, Ernest, there is no fine art without self-consciousness, and self-consciousness and the critical spirit are one. Ernest. I see what you mean, and there is much in it. But surely you would admit that the great poems of the early world, the primitive, anonymous collective poems, were the result of the imagination of races rather than of the imagination of individuals. Gilbert. Not when they became poetry, not when they received a beautiful form. For there is no art where there is no style, and no style where there is no unity, and unity is of the individual. No doubt Homer had old ballads and stories to deal with, as Shakespeare had chronicles and plays and novels from which to work, but they were merely his rough material. He took them and shaped them into song. They become his because he made them lovely. They were built out of music. And so not built at all, and therefore built forever. The longer one studies life in literature, the more strongly one feels that behind everything that is wonderful stands the individual, and that it is not the moment that makes the man, but the man who creates the age. Indeed, I am inclined to think that each myth and legend that seems to us to spring out of the wonder or terror or fancy of tribe and nation was in its origin the invention of one single mind. The curiously limited number of the myths seem to me to point to this conclusion. But we must not go off into questions of comparative mythology. We must keep to criticism. And what I want to point out is this. An age that has no criticism is either an age in which art is immobile, hieratic, and confined to the reproduction of formal types, or an age that possesses no art at all. There have been critical ages that have not been creative in the ordinary sense of the word, ages in which the spirit of man has sought to set in order the treasures of his treasure house, to separate the gold from the silver, and the silver from the lead, to count over the jewels, and to give names to the pearls. But there has never been a creative age that has not been critical also, for it is the critical faculty that invents fresh forms. The tendency of creation is to repeat itself. It is to the critical instinct what we owe each new school that springs up, each new mold that art finds ready to its hand. There is really not a single form that art now uses that does not come to us from the critical spirit of Alexandria, where these forms were neither stereotyped nor invented or made perfect. I say Alexandria not merely because it was there that the Greek spirit became most self-conscious, and indeed ultimately expired in skepticism and theology, but because it was to that city, and not to Athens, that Rome turned for her models, and it was through the survival, such as it was, of the Latin language that culture lived at all. When, at the Renaissance, Greek literature dawned upon Europe, the soil had been in some measure prepared for it. But, to get rid of the details of history, which are always wearisome and usually inaccurate, let us say generally that the forms of art have been due to the Greek critical spirit. To it we owe the epic, the lyric, the entire drama in every one of its developments, including burlesque, the idyll, the romantic novel, the novel of adventure, the essay, the dialogue, the oration, the lecture, for which perhaps we should not forgive them, and the epigram, in all the wide meaning of that word. In fact, we owe it everything except the sonnet, to which, however, some curious parallels of thought movement may be traced in the anthology, American journalism, to which no parallel can be found anywhere, and the ballad in sham Scotch dialect, which one of our most industrious writers has recently proposed should be made the basis for a final and unanimous effort on the part of our second-rate poets to make themselves really romantic. Each new school, as it appears, cries out against criticism, but it is to the critical faculty in man that it owes its origin. The mere creative instinct does not innovate, but reproduces. Ernest. You have been talking of criticism as an essential part of the creative spirit, and I now fully accept your theory. But what of criticism outside creation? I have a foolish habit of reading periodicals, and it seems to me that most modern criticism is perfectly valueless. Gilbert. So is most modern creative work also. Mediocrity weighing mediocrity in the balance, and incompetence applauding its brother. That is the spectacle which the artistic activity of England affords us from time to time. And yet I feel I am a little unfair in this matter. As a rule, the critics, I speak of course of the higher class, of those in fact who write for the sixpenny papers, are far more cultured than the people whose work they are called upon to review. This is indeed only what one would expect, for criticism demands infinitely more cultivation than creation does. Ernest. Really? Gilbert. Certainly. Anybody can write a 3-volume novel. It merely requires a complete ignorance of both life and literature. The difficulty that I should fancy the reviewer feels is the difficulty of sustaining any standard. Where there is no style, a standard must be impossible. The poor reviewers are apparently reduced to be the reporters of the police court of literature, the chroniclers of the doings of the habitual criminals of art. It is sometimes said of them that they do not read all through the works they are called upon to criticize. They do not, or at least they should not. If they did so, they would become confirmed misanthropes. Or, if I may borrow a phrase from one of the pretty Newnham graduates, confirmed womanthropes for the rest of their lives. Nor is it necessary. To know the vintage and quality of a wine, one needs not drink the whole cask. It must be perfectly easy in half an hour to say whether a book is worth anything or worth nothing. 10 minutes are really sufficient, if one has the instinct for form. Who wants to wade through a dull volume? One tastes it, and that is quite enough. More than enough, I should imagine. I am aware that there are many honest workers in paintings, as well as in literature, who object to criticism entirely. They are quite right. Their work stands in no intellectual relation to their age. It brings us no new element of pleasure. It suggests no fresh departure of thought, or passion, or beauty. It should not be spoken of. It should be left to the oblivion that it deserves. Ernest. But my dear fellow, excuse me for interrupting you. You seem to be allowing your passion for criticism to lead you a great deal too far. For after all, even you must admit that it is much more difficult to do a thing than to talk about it. Gilbert. More difficult to do a thing than to talk about it? Not at all. That is a gross popular error. It is very much more difficult to talk about a thing than to do it. In the sphere of actual life, that is of course obvious. Anybody can make history. Only a great man can write it. There is no mode of action, no form of emotion that we do not share with the lower animals. It is only by language that we rise above them, or above each other. By language which is the parent and not the child of thought. Action, indeed, is always easy, and when presented to us in its most aggravated because most continuous form, which I take to be that of real industry, becomes simply the refuge of people who have nothing whatsoever to do. No, Ernest, don't talk about action. It is a blind thing dependent on external influences, and moved by an impulse of whose nature it is unconscious. It is a thing incomplete in its essence, because limited by accident and ignorant of its direction, being always at variance with its aim. Its basis is the lack of imagination. It is the last resource of those who know not how to dream. Ernest. Gilbert, you treat the world as if it were a crystal ball. You hold it in your hand and reverse it to please your wilful fancy. You do nothing but rewrite history. Gilbert. The one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. That is not the least of the tasks in store for the critical spirit. When we have fully discovered the scientific laws that govern life, we shall realize that the one person who has more illusions than the dreamer is the man of action. He, indeed, knows neither the origin of his deeds nor their results. From the field in which he thought that he had sown thorns, we have gathered our vintage, and the fig tree that he had planted for our pleasure is as barren as the thistle, and more bitter. It is because humanity has never known where it was going that it has always been able to find its way. Ernest. You think, then, that in the sphere of action a conscious aim is a delusion? Gilbert. It is worse than a delusion. If we lived long enough to see the results of our actions, it may be that those who call themselves good would be sickened with a dull remorse, and those whom the world calls evil stirred by a noble joy. Each little thing that we do passes into the great machine of life, which may grind our virtues to powder and make them worthless, or transform our sins into elements of a new civilization, more marvelous and more splendid than any that has gone before. But men are the slaves of words. They rage against materialism, as they call it, forgetting that there has been no material improvement that does not spiritualize the world, and that there have been few, if any, spiritual awakenings that have not wasted the world's faculties in barren hopes and fruitless aspirations, and empty or trammeling creeds. What is termed sin is an essential element of progress. Without it, the world would stagnate, or grow old, or become colorless. By its curiosity, sin increases the experience of the race. Through its intensified assertion of individualism, it saves us from monotony of type. In its rejection of the current notions about morality, it is one with the higher ethics. And as for the virtues, what are the virtues? Nature, M. Renan tells us, cares little about chastity. And it may be that it is to the shame of the Magdalene, and not to their own purity, that the Lucretius of modern life owe their freedom from stain. Charity, as even those whose religion it makes a formal part have been compelled to acknowledge, creates a multitude of evils. The mere existence of conscience, that faculty of which people prate so much nowadays, and are so ignorantly proud, is a sign of our imperfect development. It must be merged in instinct before we become fine. Self-denial is simply a method by which man arrests his progress, and self-sacrifice a survival of the mutilation of the savage, part of that old worship of pain, which is so terrible a factor in the history of the world, and which even now makes its victims day by day, and has its altars in the land. Virtues. Who knows what the virtues are? Not you, not I, not anyone. It is well for our vanity that we slay the criminal, for if we suffered him to live, he might show us what we had gained by his crime. It is well for his peace that the saint goes to his martyrdom. He is spared the sight of the horror of his harvest. Ernest. Gilbert, you sound too harsh a note. Let us go back to the more gracious fields of literature. What was it you said? That it was more difficult to talk about a thing than to do it? Gilbert, after a pause. Yes, I believe I ventured upon that simple truth. Surely you see now that I am right. When man acts, he is a puppet. When he describes, he is a poet. The whole secret lies in that. It was easy enough on the sandy plains by windy Ilion to send the notched arrow from the pointed bow, or to hurl against the shield of hide and flame-like brass the long ash-handled spear. It was easy for the adulterous queen to spread the Tyrian carpets for her lord, and then, as he lay couched in the marble bath, to throw over his head the purple net, and call to her smooth-faced lover to stab through the meshes at the heart that should have broken at Aulis. For Antigone even, with death waiting for her as her bridegroom, it was easy to pass through the tainted air at noon, and climb the hill, and strew with kindly earth the wretched naked corse that had no tomb. But what of those who wrote about these things? What of those who gave them reality, and made them live forever? Are they not greater than the men and women they sing of? Hector, that sweet knight, is dead. And Lucian tells us how in the dim underworld Menippus saw the bleaching skull of Helen, and marveled that it was for so grim a favor that all those horned ships were launched, those beautiful mailed men laid low, those towered cities brought to dust. Yet every day the swan-like daughter of Leda comes out of the battlements and looks down at the tide of war. The greybeards wonder at her loveliness, and she stands by the side of the king. In her chamber of stained ivory lies her leman. He is polishing his dainty armor and combing the scarlet plume. With squire and page her husband passes from tent to tent. She can see his bright hair, and hears, or fancies that she hears, that clear cold voice. In the courtyard below, the son of Priam is buckling on his brazen cuirass. The white arms of Andromache are around his neck. He sets his helmet on the ground, lest their babe should be frightened. Behind the embroidered curtains of his pavilion sits Achilles, in perfumed raiment, while in harness of gilt and silver the friend of his soul arrays himself to go forth to the fight. From a curiously carven chest that his mother Thetis had brought to his shipside, the lord of the Myrmidons takes out that mystic chalice that the lip of man had never touched, and cleanses it with brimstone, and with fresh water cools it, and having washed his hands, fills the black wine its burnished hollow, and spills the thick grape blood upon the ground in honor of him who at Dodona barefooted prophets worshipped, and prays to him, and knows not that he prays in vain. And by the hands of two knights from Troy, Pentheus' son, Ephorbus, whose love-locks were looped with gold, and the Priamid, the lion-hearted Patroclus, the comrade of comrades, must meet his doom. Phantoms are they? Heroes of mist and mountain? Shadows in a song? No, they are real. Action. What is action? It dies at the moment of its energy. It is a base concession to fact. The world is made by the singer for the dreamer. Ernest. While you talk, it seems to me to be so. Gilbert. It is so in truth. On the mouldering citadel of Troy lies the lizard like a thing of green bronze. The owl has built her nest in the palace of Priam. Over the empty plain wander shepherd and goatherd with their flocks, and where on the wine-surfaced oily sea, the wine-dark sea, as Homer calls it, copper-proud and streaked with vermilion, the great galleys of the Danoi came in their gleaming crescent. The lonely tunny-fisher sits in his little boat and watches the bobbing corks of his net. Yet every morning the doors of the city are thrown open, and on foot or in horse-drawn chariot the warriors go forth to battle and mock their enemies from behind their iron masks. All day long the fight rages, and when night comes, the torches gleam by the tents, and the cresset burns in the hall. Those who live in marble or on painted panel know of life, but a single exquisite instant, eternal indeed in its beauty, but limited to one note of passion or one mood of calm. Those whom the poet makes live have their myriad emotions of joy and terror, of courage and despair, of pleasure and of suffering. The seasons come and go in glad or saddening pageant, and with winged or leaden feet the years pass by before them. They have their youth and their manhood. They are children, and they grow old. It is always dawn for St. Helena, as Veronese saw her at the window. Through the still morning air, the angels bring her the symbol of God's pain. The cool breezes of the morning lift the gilt threads from her brow. On that little hill by the city of Florence, where the lovers of Giorgione are lying, it is always the solstice of noon made so languorous by summer suns that hardly can the slim naked girl dip into the marble tank, the round bubble of clear glass, and the long fingers of the lute-player rest idly upon the chords. It is the twilight always for the dancing nymphs, whom Corot set free from among the silver poplars of France. In eternal twilight they move, those frail diaphanous figures, whose tremulous white feet seem not to touch the dew-drenched grass they tread on. But those who walk in epos, drama, or romance see through the laboring months the young moons wax and wane, and watch the night from evening unto morning star, and from sunrise unto sunsetting can note the shifting day with all its gold and shadow. For them, as for us, the flowers bloom and wither, and the earth, that green-tressed goddess, as Coleridge calls her, alters her raiment for their pleasure. The statue is concentrated to the one moment of perfection. The image stained upon the canvas possesses no spiritual element of growth or change. If they know nothing of death, it is because they know little of life. For the secrets of life and death belong to those, and those only, whom the sequence of time affects, and who possess not merely the present but the future, and can rise or fall from a past of glory or of shame. Movement, that problem of the visible arts, can be truly realized by literature alone. It is literature that shows us the body in its swiftness, and the soul in its unrest. Ernest: Yes, I see now what you mean. But surely the higher you place the creative artist, the lower must the critic rank. Gilbert: Why so? Ernest: Because the best that he can give us will be out of an echo of rich music, a dim shadow of clear outlined form. It may indeed be that life is chaos, as you tell me that it is, that its martyrdoms are mean and its heroisms ignoble, and that it is the function of literature to create, from the rough material of actual existence, a new world that will be more marvelous, more enduring, and more true than the world that common eyes look upon, and through which common nature seeks to realize their perfection. But surely, if this new world had been made by the spirit and touch of a great artist, it will be a thing so complete and perfect that there will be nothing left for the critic to do. I quite understand now, and indeed admit most readily, that it is far more difficult to talk about a thing than to do it. But it seems to me that this sound and sensible maxim, which is really extremely soothing to one's feelings, and should be adopted as its motto by every academy of literature all over the world, applies only to the relations that exist between art and life, and not to any relations that there may be between art and criticism. Gilbert: But surely criticism is itself an art, and just as artistic creation implies the working of the critical faculty, and indeed without it cannot be said to exist at all, so criticism is really creative in the highest sense of the word. Criticism is, in fact, both creative and independent. Ernest: Independent? Gilbert: Yes, independent. Criticism is no more to be judged by any low standard of imitation or resemblance than is the work of poet or sculptor. The critic occupies the same relation to the work of art that he criticizes as the art does to the visible world of form and color, or the unseen world of passion and of thought. He does not even require for the perfection of his art the finest materials. Anything will serve his purpose. And just as out of the sordid and sentimental amours of the silly wife of a small country doctor in the squalid village of Yonville-l'Abbaye, near Rouen, Gustave Flaubert was able to create a classic, and make a masterpiece of style. So from subjects of little or of no importance, such as the pictures in this year's Royal Academy, or in any year's Royal Academy for that matter, Mr. Lewis Morris's poems, M. Honnet's novels, or the plays of Mr. Henry Arthur Jones, the true critic can, if it be his pleasure, so to direct his waste, his faculty of contemplation, produce work that will be flawless in beauty and instinct with intellectual subtlety. Why not? Dullness is always an irresistible temptation for brilliancy, and stupidity is the permanent bestia triumphans that calls wisdom from its cave. To an artist so creative as the critic, what does subject matter signify? No more and no less than it does to the novelist and the painter. Like them, he can find his motives everywhere. Treatment is the test. There is nothing that has not in its suggestion or challenge. Ernest. But is criticism really a creative art? Gilbert. Why should it not be? It works with materials and puts them into a form that is at once new and delightful. What more can one say of poetry? Indeed, I would call criticism a creation within a creation. For just as the great artist, from Homer to Aeschylus down to Shakespeare and Keats, did not go directly to life for their subject matter, but sought for it in myth and legend and ancient tale, so the critic deals with materials that others have, as it were, purified for them, and to which imaginative form and color have already been added. Nay, more, I would say that the highest criticism, being the purest form of personal impression, is in its way more creative than creation, as it has least reference to any standard external to itself, and is, in fact, its own reasoning for existing, and as the Greeks would put it, in itself and to itself an end. Certainly it is never trammeled by any shackles of verisimilitude. No ignoble considerations of probability, that cowardly concession to the tedious repetitions of domestic or public life affect it ever. One may appeal from fiction unto fact, but from the soul there is no appeal. Ernest. From the soul? Gilbert. Yes, from the soul. That is what the highest criticism really is, the record of one's own soul. It is more fascinating than history, as it is concerned simply with oneself. It is more delightful than philosophy, as its subject is concrete and not abstract, real and not vague. It is the only civilized form of autobiography, as it deals not with the events, but with the thoughts of one's life. Not with life's physical accidents of deed or circumstance, but with the spiritual moods and imaginative passions of the mind. I am always amused by the silly vanity of those writers and artists of our day, who seem to imagine that the primary function of the critic is to chatter about their second-rate work. The best that one could say of most modern creative art is that it is just a little less vulgar than reality, and so the critic, with his fine sense of distinction and sure instinct of delicate refinement, will prefer to look into the silver mirror or through the woven veil, and will turn his eyes away from the chaos and clamor of actual existence, though the mirror be tarnished and the veil be torn. His sole aim is to chronicle his own impressions. It is for him that pictures are painted, books written, and marble hewn into form. Ernest. I seem to have heard another theory of criticism. Gilbert. Yes, it has been said by one whose gracious memory we all revere, and the music of whose pipe once lured Proserpina from her Sicilian fields, and made those white feet stir, and not in vain, the Cumnor cowslips, and the proper aim of criticism is to see the object as in itself it really is. But this is a very serious error, and takes no cognizance of criticism's most perfect form, which is in its essence purely subjective, and seeks to reveal its own secret, and not the secret of another. For the highest criticism deals with art not as expressive, but as impressive purely. Ernest. But is that really so? Gilbert. Of course it is. Who cares whether Mr. Ruskin's views on Turner are sound or not? What does it matter? That mighty and majestic prose of his, so fervid and so fiery-colored in its noble eloquence, so rich in its elaborate symphonic music, so sure and certain at its best, and subtle choice of word and epithet, is at least as great a work of art as any of those wonderful sunsets that bleach or rot on their corrupted canvases in England's gallery. Greater indeed, one is apt to think at times, not merely because its equal beauty is more enduring, but on account of the fuller variety of its appeal, soul speaking to soul in those long cadenced lines, not through form and color alone, though through these indeed completely and without loss, but with intellectual and emotional utterance, with lofty passion and with loftier thought, with imaginative insight and with poetic aim. Greater, I always think, even as literature is the greater art. Who, again, cares whether Mr. Pater has put into the portrait of Mona Lisa something that Leonardo never dreamed of? The painter may have been merely the slave of an archaic smile, as some have fancied, but whenever I pass into the cool galleries of the Palace of the Louvre, and stand before that strange figure set in its marble chair in that cirque of fantastic rocks, as in some faint light under sea, I murmur to myself, she is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times, and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen day about her, and trafficked for strange webs with Eastern merchants, and as Leda was the mother of Helen of Troy, and as Saint Anne the mother of Mary, and all this has been to her but as the sound of lyres and flutes, and lives only in the delicacy with which it has molded the changing lineaments, and tinged the eyelids and the hands. And I say to my friend, the presence that thus so strangely rose beside the waters is expressive of what in the ways of 1,000 years man had come to desire. And he answers me, hers is the head upon which all the ends of the world are come, and the eyelids are a little weary. And so the picture becomes more wonderful to us than it really is, and reveals to us a secret of which, in truth, it knows nothing. And the music of the mystical prose is as sweet in our ears as was that flute player's music that lent to the lips of La Gioconda those subtle and poisonous curves. Do you ask me what Leonardo would have said had any one told him of this picture that all the thoughts and experience of the world had etched and molded there in that which they had of power to refine and make expressive the outward form, the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the reverie of the Middle Age with its spiritual ambition and imaginative loves, the return of the pagan world, the sins of the Borgias? He would probably have answered that he had contemplated none of these things, but had concerned himself simply with certain arrangements of lines and masses, and with new and curious color harmonies of blue and green. And it is for this very reason that the criticism which I have quoted is criticism of the highest kind. It treats the work of art simply as a starting point for a new creation. It does not confine itself, let us at least suppose so for the moment, to discovering the real intention of the artist and accepting that as final. And in this it is right, for the meaning of any beautiful created thing is, at least, as much in the soul of him who looks at it as it was in his soul who wrought it. Nay, it is rather the beholder who lends to the beautiful thing its myriad meanings, and makes it marvelous for us, and sets it in some new relation to the age, so that it becomes a vital portion of our lives, and a symbol of what we pray for, or perhaps of what, having prayed for, we fear that we may receive. The longer I study Ernest, the more clearly I see that the beauty of the visible arts is, as the beauty of music, impressive primarily, and that it may be marred, and indeed often is so, by an excess of intellectual intention on the part of the artist. For when the work is finished, it has as it were an independent life of its own, and may deliver a message far other than that which was put into its lips to say. Sometimes, when I listen to the overture to Tannhäuser, I seem indeed to see that comely knight treading delicately on the flower-strewn grass, and to hear the voice of Venus calling to him from the caverned hill. But at other times it speaks to me of 1,000 different things, of myself, it may be, and my own life, or of the lives of others whom one has loved and grown weary of loving, or of the passions that man has known, or of the passions that man has not known, and so has sought for. Tonight it may fill one with the love of the impossible, which falls like a madness on many who think they live securely and out of reach of harm. so that they sicken suddenly with the poison of unlimited desire, and in the infinite pursuit of what they may not obtain, grow faint and swoon or stumble. Tomorrow, like the music of which Aristotle and Plato tells us, the noble Dorian music of the Greek, it may perform the office of a physician, and give us an anodyne against pain, and heal the spirit that is wounded, and bring the soul into harmony with all right things. And what is true about music is true about all the arts. Beauty has as many meanings as man has moods. Beauty is the symbol of symbols. Beauty reveals everything because it expresses nothing. When it shows us itself, it shows us the whole fiery-colored world. Ernest. But is such work as you have talked about really criticism? Gilbert. It is the highest criticism, for it criticizes not merely the individual work of art, but beauty itself, and fills with wonder a form which the artist may have left void, or not understood, or understood incompletely. Ernest. The highest criticism, then, is more creative than creation, and the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not? That is your theory, I believe? Gilbert. Yes, that is my theory. To the critic, the work of art is simply a suggestion for a new work of his own, that need not necessarily bear any obvious resemblance to the thing it criticizes. The one characteristic of a beautiful form is that one can put into it whatever one wishes, and see in it whatever one chooses to see. And the beauty that gives to creation its universal and aesthetic element makes the critic a creator in his turn, and whispers of 1,000 different things which were not present in the mind of him who carved the statue, or painted the panel, or graved the gem. It is sometimes said by those who understand neither the nature of the highest criticism nor the charm of the highest art, that the pictures that the critic loves most to write about are those that belong to the anecdotage of painting, and deal with scenes taken out of literature or history. But this is not so. Indeed, pictures of this kind are far too intelligible. As a class, they rank with illustrations, and even considered from this point of view are failures, as they do not stir the imagination, but set definite bounds to it. For the domain of the painter is, as I suggested above, more widely different from that of the poet. To the latter belongs life in its full and absolute entirety, not merely the beauty that men look at, but the beauty that men listen to also. Not merely the momentary grace of form or the transient gladness of color, but the whole sphere of feeling, the perfect cycle of thought. The painter is so far limited that it is only through the mask of the body that he can show us the mystery of the soul, only through conventional images that he can handle ideas, only through its physical equivalents that he can deal with psychology. And how inadequately does he do it, then, asking us to accept the torn turban of the Moor for the noble rage of Othello, or a dotard in a storm for the wild madness of Lear? Yet it seems as if nothing could stop him. Most of our elderly English painters spend their wicked and wasted lives in poaching upon the domain of the poets, marring their motives by clumsy treatment, and striving to render by visible form or color the marvel of what is invisible, the splendor of what is not seen. Their pictures are, as a natural consequence, insufferably tedious. They have degraded the invisible arts into the obvious arts, and the one thing not worth looking at is the obvious. I do not say that poet and painter may not treat of the same subject. They have always done so, and will always do so. But while the poet can be pictorial or not, as he chooses, the painter must be pictorial always. For a painter is limited, not to what he sees in nature, but to what upon canvas may be seen. And so, my dear Ernest, pictures of this kind will not really fascinate the critic. He will turn from them to such works as make him brood and dream and fancy, to works that possess the subtle quality of suggestion, and seem to tell one that even from them there is an escape into a wider world. It is sometimes said that the tragedy of an artist's life is that he cannot realize his ideal. But the true tragedy that dogs the steps of most artists is that they realize their ideal too absolutely. For when the ideal is realized, it is robbed of its wonder and its mystery. and it becomes simply a new starting point for an ideal that is other than itself. This is the reason why music is the perfect type of art. Music can never reveal its ultimate secret. This also is the explanation of the value of limitations in art. The sculptor gladly surrenders imitative color, and the painter the actual dimensions of form, because by such renunciations they are able to avoid too definite a presentation of the real, which would be mere imitation, and too definite a realization of the ideal, which would be too purely intellectual. It is through its very incompleteness that art becomes complete in beauty, and so addresses itself not to the faculty of recognition nor to the faculty of reason, but to the aesthetic sense alone, which, while accepting both reason and recognition as stages of apprehension, subordinates them both to a pure synthetic impression of the work of art as a whole, and, taking whatever alien emotional elements the work may possess, uses their very complexity as a means by which a richer unity may be added to the ultimate impression itself. You see then how it is that the aesthetic critic rejects those obvious modes of art that have but one message to deliver, and having delivered it become dumb and sterile, and seeks rather for such modes as suggest reverie and mood, and by their imaginative beauty make all interpretations true, and no interpretation final. Some resemblance, no doubt, the creative work of the critic will have to the work that has stirred him to creation, but it will be such resemblance as exists not between nature and the mirror that the painter of landscape or figure may be supposed to hold up to her, but between nature and the work of the decorative artist. Just as on the flowerless carpets of Persia, tulip and rose blossom indeed, and are lovely to look on, though they are not reproduced in visible shape or line. Just as the pearl and purple of the seashell is echoed in the church of St. Mark at Venice. Just as the vaulted ceiling of the wondrous chapel at Ravenna is made gorgeous by the gold and green and sapphire of the peacock's tail, though the birds of Juno fly not across it. So the critic reproduces the work that he criticizes in a mode that is never imitative, and part of whose charm may really consist in the rejection of resemblance, and shows us in this way not merely the meaning, but also the mystery of beauty, and by transforming each art into literature, solves once and for all the problem of art's unity. But I see it is time for supper. After we have discussed some Chambertin and a few ortolans, we will pass on to the question of the critic considered in light of the interpreter. Ernest. Ah, you admit then that the critic may occasionally be allowed to see the object as in itself it really is. Gilbert. I am not quite sure. Perhaps I may admit it after supper. There is a subtle influence in supper. This is the end of The Critic as Artist, Part 1, by Oscar Wilde. Thank you for listening.